Hello, everyone. I am Bill Batterman. I coach debate at Woodward Academy, and I'm here with Will Repko. Hi, Will.
Hello.
We are going to talk today a little bit about the transition that debaters are confronting as they prepare to continue debating the criminal justice reform topic under a new administration, new president, new Congress, and kind of a significantly different context. And for high school debaters, they haven't experienced this before. The last time that president changed during the course of a season was 2016, 2017. We were debating about China. Obama was the president, and then Trump was the president, and that significantly changed things. Before that, in 2008, 2009, Obama took over from George W. Bush. So the first thing I want to ask is just having gone through that a few times, what big picture advice do you have for students as they think about how to prepare to continue debating the same topic? So we're still debating criminal justice reform for the next semester, but the political context is now dramatically different. Biden is the president, he's staffing his administration, they'll have different priorities, he's issuing this slew of executive orders, the Democrats are narrowly in control of the Senate and in control of the House. How would you think about, if you were suggesting to students and coaches, how would you think about preparing differently for the second semester because of that political change?
Well, the first thing I would do is to kind of dismiss the idea that every single piece of evidence that you have in your Dropbox and every single strategy that you've used up to this point is completely irrelevant because all evidence needs to be after the inauguration. I don't think every card needs to be from 2021. And while the break between the Trump administration and the Biden administration is significant, it's not actually significant on every single item that might appear in your files. So that brings me to my second point, which is what evidence is really not going to cut it if it fails to assume the Biden administration. And there are a lot of debate impact cards that sort of operate on the assumption that Trump was an unprecedented actor, a little bit more prone to a security risk or a little bit more prone to an overreaction. And I think anything in that bucket is easily defeated by the analytic that it doesn't assume Joe Biden. So a lot of foreign policy impacts that debaters sometimes gravitate towards needs to assume the potentially radical shift in foreign policy. But that doesn't mean that every disadvantage that one could write or, broader questions of the abolition K are just automatically irrelevant because Joe Biden is so different than Donald Trump on every issue across the board. I don't think that that is the case.
So for students that have only debated during the Trump administration, it can be hard to zoom out and kind of understand all of the ways that in practice and in the way that it's debated, the Trump administration really changed how the government works and how arguments about the government play out. I think I want to start by talking about politics disadvantages, agenda politics disadvantages. And for the generation of students that is currently in high school, they've never really debated an agenda politics dissad that is of the classic variety that came to prominence in the 1980s and 1990s and into the early aughts. I think a lot of people identify the 2010 midterms as the point in which the kind of previous agenda politics DA sort of lost its essence and lost its strategicness because of the way that the Tea Party Republicans and their kind of scorched earth politics then played out. But for the first time in a long time, it seems like we might see agenda politics DAs again. Disadvantages about Biden's political capital, disadvantages about bipartisanship in the Congress, disadvantages about, in particular, moderate Republicans and moderate Democrats, the kind of Manchins and Collinses of the Senate. I'm interested in your opinion. Do you think that we're going to see a return to that style of politics DA? Do you think the politics DA is going to see something of a resurgence? Or do you think that the changes that have happened in American politics that sort of predate Trump but then manifested most during the Trump administration are too much here to stay, and that the politics dissad of the 1990s and early 2000s is just never going to return?
The short answer to your question is I do think that those disadvantages will make a comeback. The second answer I have to your question is even if the listening audience is still not a fan of the reboot of the politics DA, now is an important time to learn some distinctions, because even if you think that those disadvantages aren't that strong, other people are very apt to run them against you. And the last thing I'll say is that I do think we need to talk about kind of how we got here in a little bit greater detail. In an era that's gone by, there was a body of literature, and more broadly, when you talk to people who were former debaters that, worked in Congress or were on a staff, they would say there was compromise between the parties. There were moments where the minority party realized that if they couldn't get what they wanted, then plan B was to get some sort of compromise that was close to what they wanted. And after 2010, when the Obama administration started to lose its numbers in Congress, a lot of people feel as though the strategy of the Republicans moved from not just sort of a compromise where there'd be some back and forth and the introduction of a new plan could offset those compromises, but instead to just be, as you said, scorched earth and just be like, the best outcome if we cannot get what we want is to never give a victory to our opponents. And that sort of did make the give and take part of the politics DA dead on arrival, because the affirmative was in a very effective spot at simply saying no one's votes in the Congress could ever swing as the result of the introduction of a new affirmative plan, that everyone's mind is made up ideologically and compromises off the table. Now, fast forward to not only the 2020 election, but in particular, the Georgia runoff elections in January of 2021, and you have 50 Democratic members of the United States Senate, 50 Republican members of the United States Senate, and compromise is much more back in play. And I don't just say that in theory, a lot of people are writing about it. And so you're going to see more disads that are specific to a small range of either conservative Democrats or more moderate Republicans, because they're the kingmakers in the Senate. And unless you keep those people happy with your criminal justice reform, you're going to see it cost the Biden administration some legislative endeavors that they would otherwise be interested in. And so I do think that that 50-50 hair split vote is just so enticing for the negative to consider writing a dissent about Senator Sinema, about Senator Manchin, about Senator Collins or Romney, etc.
One of the things that I think is interesting about politics disadvantages that the current generation of students probably doesn't really know is that for a long time, the politics disadvantage was constructed from a combination of kind of current events, news articles, and scholarly political science cards from experts who studied the presidential agenda and the legislative process, and who evaluated kind of with a historical or theoretical lens the inner workings of Washington. And that for a while, people tried to continue to read those arguments during the late Obama administration and even into the Trump administration, but they've mostly given up because it seemed like those cards were describing a reality that no longer existed. And it will be interesting to see if the Biden's kind of self-professed image of himself as a person with significant Senate experience who can kind of return to the style of Senate deal making that he came of age participating in will lead to a resurgence of that style of political science literature and of that style of argumentation. I'm interested in your suggestions for students if they want to start diving into that. Where would you suggest students start? Do you think it's valuable? I was thinking maybe to suggest to students to look at some politics disadvantages from the late Bush and early Obama administration to get a sense of those files, kind of the types of cards that are in there. I don't know if you agree with that. And do you have any other suggestions for how students who really don't have any experience, reading that stuff, where they can start and how they can get up to speed? looking forward, as they're probably going to have to start debating those arguments in the coming year.
Yeah, I would be happy to post publicly what I think the most significant thing that students could kind of review in order to get up to speed on this. And it's all going to come down to, for lack of a better phrase, the internal link cards that say that political actions can spill over from item A, criminal justice reform, to unrelated item B, a COVID relief package, a nomination fight, an immigration bill, or, Biden's infrastructure agenda. Michigan State University has already, on the college level, on a slightly different topic, been running a disadvantage about Biden's agenda. And I would say that the evidence that you could find in the open source of those documents is especially strong at outlining the names of senators that are not purely ideological and that might be sort of more willing to give a little on item A if they got a little on item B. And all of that old research could even go back to, journal articles from the Political Science Quarterly and other places that come off the top of my head, where there's huge, as you say, scientific political science research about whether or not issues are compartmentalized, meaning that if you anger me on item X, it is in a compartment and I'm mad about item X, but it doesn't change how I vote for your agenda on item Y, or whether or not politicians are extremely human and they trade and they don't just compartmentalize item X and Y. But ultimately, if you're kind of intrigued by this discussion and you want to brush up a politics disadvantage of your own, you definitely do need to read evidence from 2021 that is descriptive of the current Congress and suggests the names of senators that are willing to make trades on a variety of items. Because if you can't answer the cross-examination question with specifics as it relates to the current US Senate, and instead can only answer it with generalities about like how political theory works, you're at a disadvantage. You definitely need to be able to point to a particular kind of member of the United States Senate that would really, really like CJR or would really, really dislike CJR, and what that might mean for how they would vote on other unrelated agenda items.
The thing that I've been noticing as I start researching politics during the Biden era is that so many of the concepts that used to just be sort of stock issues in politics debates, like what you were describing, that whether issues are compartmentalized or whether there's spillover between issues, or even something as simple as the old winners win link turn, just completely vanished from debate, and for good reason. President Trump didn't really have a legislative agenda. He didn't really have political capital with the Congress. The way that Congress and the president interacted with one another was just dramatically different. And so I think it made sense that the politics DA, while it still existed to some extent for strategic reasons, it really fell out of favor. And it'll be really interesting to see if there's any innovations from the disads that existed in the kind of early Obama era. I think the last it's interesting reading about the Biden administration, but the last really good politics disadvantage was probably the stimulus disadvantage when Obama first took office, maybe even into the ACA debate, but probably the stimulus part, because he needed to make a decision about what to do first, and there were real political calculations being made about what to push for and with whom and in what order, and the same kind of thing that Biden is now facing, prioritizing COVID relief, perhaps prioritizing a climate bill or an immigration bill or something else. But it'll be interesting to watch students kind of learn all of that for the first time again. And it'll be interesting to see how much evolution there is and how much of a resurgence there is academically, in addition to debate-wise, about how legislation happens. I want to ask sort of a related question, maybe more of a current events thing, but it seems like Biden is going to prioritize COVID relief. A big stimulus bill might include, many things that aren't directly related, like the minimum wage increase and some other things that are slightly outside of what would have been in the last stimulus bill. But he's also got a big immigration plan that he's announced. He's announced a bunch of executive orders on climate, and it seems like he's going to push a climate bill. Do you think that so far that the breadth of Biden's legislative agenda is going to make it difficult to write a persuasive politics disadvantage because he's trying for a whole lot? Or do you think that as time goes on, he's going to return to more of what I would have described as the normal presidential agenda setting framework, which is kind of one thing at a time and pushing kind of major accomplishments or major initiatives one at a time? What do you see happening? Do you think that Biden is going to push for a broad range of legislative initiatives simultaneously, or do you think he's ultimately going to settle on a smaller number of things to push?
So whenever a new presidency sort of begins, there have been a host of campaign promises. And it's very, very tricky because you don't want to signal to all the people that voted for you, or perhaps in Biden's case, some people may have voted for him with some uncertainties. You don't want to signal to them that the campaign promises that you made are not a priority. But I really encourage debaters when they assess evidence on politics disadvantages to look beyond the word priority. Everything is a priority. It's a priority for me to clean the garage, and I haven't done it for the last 6 months. So politicians in the early portions of February, when there's a change in administration, are still what I would describe as in State of the Union mode, where they're sort of laundry listing all the things that they intend to do. But as you suggest, they can't do all of those things, and they certainly can't do all of those things at once. And there is a rather real and intentional decision that is made by any presidential administration in terms of how to sequence their priorities. And for everyone that thinks that the idea of the politics disadvantage and the idea of sort of protecting and championing the political capital that the president has, everyone who thinks that that's silly is sort of belied by the real world. The Obama administration made a decision about what they would sequence first because they knew if they sequenced it later, it wouldn't have as good of an opportunity to get across the finish line. Everyone makes those decisions. Maybe they make them correctly, maybe they make them incorrectly. There's a host of political science which suggests that presidents have indeed in the past sort of come up with the wrong sequence. But I do think that his administration will advertise its goals as broad, but will reach the conclusion, the Biden administration will ultimately conclude that they need to kind of, make a sequence with specific agenda items in the manner that's described. And to go a little bit beyond the scope of your question, I think the really difficult things, the things that are going to potentially not enjoy a lot of support in Congress, are going to need to be sequenced relatively early between now and the midterm elections of 2022, because there will be a fear, right or wrong, that in 2022, the very, very narrow razor-thin majority that the Democrats enjoy in the U.S. Senate and in the House might no longer be there, and that now is the window to get big Democratic priorities across the table. And that's all part of the politics disadvantage.